The American Civil War remains the most devastating conflict in the nation's history. By the time the guns fell silent, the fighting had claimed more American lives than any other war before or since. These casualties were the result of a slow-building collision between two entirely different ways of life that had been forced to share a single country. Look at this illustration of an early industrial complex. The northern states were pouring their energy into modernization. They were building massive factories, laying down miles of interconnected railroads, and growing their cities at an incredible pace. The southern economy operated on a different foundation. As we can see in this photograph of families outside their wooden cabins, the South relied on agriculture. Their wealth came from cotton, and that cotton was harvested through the forced labor of millions of enslaved people. Westward expansion turned these tensions into a struggle for power. Every new territory meant a fight, free state or slave state. Whoever held the balance of these new states controlled the laws and the moral direction of the entire country. For decades, leaders in Washington tried to manage this tension through agreements like the Missouri Compromise. These handwritten solutions were temporary. They delayed the conflict for a few years at a time, but they could not solve the underlying crisis. Abraham Lincoln entered this political world from a background of deep poverty, a life that looked nothing like those of the wealthy leaders in Washington. He spent his childhood in small, dirt-floor log cabins like this one. He received almost no formal schooling, learning instead through daily survival on the frontier. He was incredibly determined. After exhausting days of physical labor, he would read borrowed law books by the fire. He taught himself the law entirely on his own, eventually earning a reputation for absolute honesty. When Lincoln entered national politics, he spoke out against allowing slavery to spread into the new Western territories. To Southern leaders, his rise to power represented a direct threat to their entire economic system. The breaking point arrived in 1860. Lincoln won the presidency without receiving a single electoral vote from the Southern states. In response, South Carolina issued this ordinance, declaring it was leaving the United States to help form the Confederacy. Before Lincoln even had time to settle into office, he faced a crisis. A federal base called Fort Sumter was trapped inside newly declared Confederate territory, and its soldiers were running out of food. Lincoln faced a difficult choice. If he ordered the soldiers to leave, he would be treating the Confederacy as an independent nation. But if he sent the military to help them, he risked being the one to start a war. He chose a middle path. He sent ships to the fort, but they only carried food, no weapons, and no ammunition. This forced the Confederate leaders to decide whether they would be the ones to open fire. They chose to attack. Confederate cannons opened fire on the fort, launching a relentless bombardment that lasted for 34 continuous hours. When the soldiers inside Fort Sumter surrendered, any hope for a peaceful compromise vanished. The dispute would now be decided by blood. Lincoln responded to the attack immediately. He called for 75,000 volunteers to form an army and put down the rebellion. This massive call for troops pushed several uncommitted states to join the Confederacy. The most important of these was Virginia, home to some of the nation's most established military leaders. Among them was Robert E. Lee. At the time, Lee was considered the most brilliant military mind in the entire American armed forces. Lincoln understood Lee's value. The president actually offered Lee the job of commanding the entire Union Army in hopes of ending the war quickly, but Lee turned the president down. He chose his loyalty to his home state of Virginia over his loyalty to the Union. With Lee leading the Southern forces, both sides were now prepared for a long and devastating struggle. Both armies marched toward their first major clash near a stream called Bull Run. Both sides were confident. They each believed a single victory here would end the rebellion immediately. In the opening hours, the North seemed to be winning. As we see in this photograph of early Union troops, they arrived in disciplined lines and successfully pushed the Confederate forces backward. But just as the Southern lines were crumbling, Confederate General Thomas Jackson arrived on the battlefield with reinforcements. Jackson rode directly into the fire and refused to retreat. Seeing him hold his ground, another officer shouted that he was standing there like a stone wall, giving him the nickname Stonewall Jackson. Jackson's defense halted the Northern momentum. It gave the Confederates enough time to organize a brutal counterattack that changed the entire course of the battle. The Union forces collapsed. Discipline vanished as soldiers threw down their weapons and began running back toward Washington in a state of total panic. The retreat was pure chaos. The soldiers ran right past crowds of civilians, politicians and families who had packed picnic lunches and driven out in carriages to watch what they thought would be an easy victory. When the news of this chaotic retreat reached Lincoln at the White House, the weight of the situation became clear. The disaster at Bull Run proved that the era of political compromise was over. There would be no quick victory. America was now locked into a fight for its very survival. By 1862, the American Civil War reached a terrifying new threshold of violence. Yet, while the body count climbed, the Union's military progress remained largely frozen in place. In the East, General George McClellan commanded the Union forces. He was a brilliant organizer, but painfully cautious. He refused to move. Perfect conditions. After capturing Fort Donelson, he laid out absolute terms, unconditional enemy surrender. Where McClellan hesitated, Grant attacked. The contrast was glaring. Breaking the deadlock would require the Union to abandon its careful posturing and embrace the unrelenting, aggressive warfare that Grant brought to the battlefield. That aggressive philosophy met its greatest test at Shiloh, pushing Grant's tactical grit and psychological endurance to their absolute limits. Confederate forces launched a massive assault. The shock of the ambush tore through the woods, driving the Union Army back, nearly collapsing their defensive line. Instead of retreating, Grant refused to panic. He held the fractured line through the night, waited for reinforcements, and the moment the sun rose, he launched a sudden counterattack that broke the Confederate advance. This chart shows the staggering scale of the resulting carnage. By the time the guns fell silent at Shiloh, over 23,000 men were dead or wounded. The nation had never seen slaughter on this level before. Shiloh proved that the Union could win, but it also revealed the grim reality of what that victory demanded. To defeat the Confederacy, both sides would have to endure an unimaginable scale of human destruction. Meanwhile, in the East, the Confederacy found its own aggressive commander. Robert E. Lee took charge. He matched Grant's intensity, drove the Union forces from Richmond, and marched directly into the North. Sheer luck stopped his momentum. Union soldiers stumbled across a misplaced copy of Lee's battle plans, forcing the two massive armies into a premature, violent collision at Antietam. The fighting was horrific and concentrated. Peaceful Maryland cornfields were quickly cut to shreds by artillery and turned into sprawling graveyards. In a sunken farm road that would become known as Bloody Lane, soldiers fell in piles. By sunset, 23,000 casualties covered the field, making it the bloodiest single day in American history. Lee was forced to retreat, handing the Union a crucial strategic victory. The sheer density of the dead created a deep moral crisis. The nation was bleeding out, and returning to the exact same political borders wasn't enough to justify the price. Lincoln recognized this shift. He used the momentum of Lee's retreat from Antietam as the political opening he needed to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. The document drew strict legal boundaries, declaring that all enslaved people held within Confederate territory were to be forever free. This single order shifted the war's legal objectives. Advancing Union armies now carried the authority to dismantle the slave system wherever they marched. This shift provided an immediate tactical advantage. Black soldiers began joining the Union ranks in massive numbers, fighting directly for their own liberation. By intertwining military victory with human freedom, the Union secured a moral position that prevented European nations from intervening on the Confederacy's behalf. Even without European support, Robert E. Lee remained exceptionally dangerous. In 1863, he launched a second, even deeper invasion into the North, pushing right into Pennsylvania. The two armies collided near a small town called Gettysburg. What followed was a violent 3-day struggle that became the deadliest battle of the entire war. The Union Army anchored themselves along the high ground, making desperate, unyielding defensive stands. In the dense, rocky terrain of Little Round Top, holding the perimeter came down to sheer, brutal survival. This map illustrates the climax of the battle. Seeking to break the Union center, 12,000 Confederate soldiers marched openly across a mile of fields, directly into exploding cannons and relentless rifle fire. the attack collapsed completely. The survivors retreated, taking Lee's offensive capability with them. The tide had permanently turned against the Confederacy. At almost the exact same moment, hundreds of miles away in the west, Grant's aggressive siege tactics were forcing another breakthrough. This map highlights the strategic impact of his victory. By capturing Vicksburg, Grant handed the Union total control over the entire length of the Mississippi River. He physically split the Confederacy in half. Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana were isolated from the rest of the South, choking off critical supply lines and stranding thousands of Confederate troops. By combining Grant's relentless tactics with the legal mandate of emancipation, these twin victories broke the Confederacy's geographic and economic spine, leaving no clear way back for the
first 3 years of the Civil War. Traditional battlefield tactics produced massive casualties without breaking the Confederacy's resolve. The war had settled into a bloody, seemingly endless stalemate. This chart tracks the widening gap in manpower between the two sides. While Grant suffered losses that would have ended earlier campaigns, the Union maintained a consistent flow of reinforcements that the Confederacy simply could not match. Grant used this mathematical advantage to launch a relentless offensive through Virginia. Battle after battle, from the Wilderness to the trenches of Petersburg, he kept moving forward, regardless of the horrifying human cost. The conflict shifted from a series of tactical maneuvers into a brutal, mechanical equation of attrition. While Grant pressured the Confederate capital, General William Tecumseh Sherman opened a second front aimed at the heart of the South's interior.
Sherman's mission was total war, the systemic destruction of the South's ability to sustain itself. His troops prioritized the destruction of railroad tracks and supply depots, prying up the iron to choke off the movement of food and ammunition. This strategy led to the capture of Atlanta and a march to the sea that left hundreds of miles of wreckage behind. By destroying factories and warehouses, Sherman ensured the Confederate Army had nothing left to fight for. To win the war, the Union realized it had to destroy the South's physical and psychological capacity to function as a sovereign nation. By 1865, the Confederate defense had reached a breaking point. In the trenches of Virginia, starving soldiers faced depleted supplies and daily desertion. Grant eventually succeeded in surrounding General Robert E. Lee's remaining forces. With his supply lines cut and his retreat blocked, Lee realized there was no longer a path to victory. The two men met at Appomattox Courthouse to discuss the end of the conflict. Grant arrived in a mud-stained private's uniform, while Lee wore his finest full-dress attire to formalize the defeat. The collapse was a slow, mechanical tightening. Lee was cornered over months of siege and infrastructure destruction until surrender became reality. After 4 years of unprecedented violence, Grant offered surrender terms that prioritized reconciliation over the expected punishments for treason. These terms were designed to end fighting immediately. Confederates kept their horses, received safe passage home, and avoided federal prosecution. Removing the threat of execution convinced the army to disband rather than fight a guerrilla war. The war ended not with a mass execution, but with a deliberate policy of grace intended to bind the states back together through law. The relief following Lee's surrender lasted exactly 5 days. The national celebration was suddenly interrupted by a final act of violence. On April 14th, Abraham Lincoln attended a performance at Ford's Theater. In the wake of victory, the high security had been momentarily relaxed. John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate supporter, entered the presidential box and shot Lincoln in the back of the head. He fled the theater, leaving the nation in a state of sudden, deep mourning. The man who had engineered the Union's survival and the end of slavery was struck down just as the first steps toward peace were being taken. This chart shows the staggering scale of the tragedy. More than 600,000 Americans died to resolve the conflict, a loss of life that remains unprecedented in the country's history. Lincoln's death became the final price of that conflict. He was the last casualty in a war that had finally eradicated the institution of slavery. This 1865 timeline, moving from the destruction of Georgia to the mercy shown at Appomattox and ending in national mourning, synchronized the political reality of the North and South for the first time. The Civil War resolved the question of whether a state could legally leave the Union. After 1865, the United States was no longer referred to in the plural as a collection of parts, but in the singular